Hello, everyone. Dwayna Boswell O'Shell here for another installment of Ask an Attorney Live. Um, you can see I've gotten some more of my setup behind me. I've got a green screen going. Um, Next, I'm going to have to learn how to actually get a virtual background on Facebook Live. So that's in the works. And I just want to say that our thoughts and prayers are those of you in Louisiana or that may have loved ones in Louisiana that were affected by Hurricane Laura. We're with you, and we're praying for you, and we hope that things recover quickly for you. Um, I know here in Houston, we're having some storms move in and out, but nothing compared to what our neighbors to the east experienced over the last few days. So just just keep them in your prayers and your thoughts, and Boswell Law Firm's here to help any way that we can. So I know last week we talked about part one of this series of how you keep what's yours if you have separate property when you're going through a divorce. So this week I'm going to talk about one of the methods that you can use, which is called tracing. Um, and tracing is used whenever we have either separate property that has what we call mutated, so it's changed forms, or if it's been commingled with community property. A good example of something that's really easy to commingle is, let's say you have a bank account and it's got an inheritance that you received during marriage, and you deposit all the money in that bank account. It's in your name. It's a bank account that you had prior to marriage, but then you start earning interest on that bank account, and that interest is community property, even though it's separate funds as the principal of the account. So most people don't think to take the interest away into a separate account each month. And so as that interest accumulates, you get more and more of a commingling of those funds. And so um, it's this is a method that you can use to show which part of that is separate property and which is community property, even though they're in the same account and mingling. And so, to establish a property's character, which is separate or community, via tracing, there's some different things that you can do. Um, so there's item tracing, which is used for non-cash typically, and that's first you got to show how the property was attained, and then you must trace each time that it has changed. So, for instance, let's say that you had a house prior to marriage, and then when you get married, you sell your separate property house, and then you put that money into a car. That car was bought during the marriage, so it's presumed that it is community property. And if it's, but because you use separate property funds to buy it, it technically is separate property. And so, sorry, I've got dogs fighting outside my door here. And so you want to make sure that you can show that you use the funds from the sale of your house to buy that car, and that car actually remains separate property even though it's purchased during the marriage. It was used separate property funds. And so as things mutate, you might sell that car and get a new car. So that car will retain its separate property character, even though normally it would be community property. So there's value tracing, which is used to trace cash assets. And there's a few different methods that you can use to do tracing of cash assets. One is what we call the clearinghouse method, and that's probably pretty easy to to monitor or find out. Basically, you would deposit. Let's say you got an inheritance of $100,000. You put that into the community property bank account, and immediately withdraw it and put it into a separate account. that's pretty easy. You can show you deposit 100,000 and pretty close to that deposit, you withdraw 100,000. And you want to make sure that those transactions equal each other if you're going to use this method. And it's best used whenever the in and out of that money occurs pretty close together. Then we have an identical sum inference method, and it's a variation of the clearinghouse method involving a single deposit and a single withdrawal as an identical or nearly identical amount. And so with the same example, because the deposit amount and the withdrawal amount are virtually identical, it's possible to infer that the money was withdrawn was the same character as the money that was deposited. So it's very, very close to the clearinghouse method, but this one has more of a inference. And this is probably used if they're withdrawn a little bit further apart. Then we have the minimum sum balance method, and that's used when the value of a separate property deposit can be identified, and there have been only a few identifiable withdrawals or deposits. And under this method, as long as the balance of the account never goes below the value of the separate property deposit, then property will remain in the account. So if you have an account, you put $100,000 in it, and it has 150, you withdraw 50,000 out of that account, then the inference is what's left there is the separate property 100,000. Another method is what we call the community out first, and that's when it's often applied when community funds and separate funds have been commingled into a single account for a long period of time. Under this method, there's a presumption that community funds are withdrawn first. So any money that comes out of the account is presumed is going to be community before separate property funds are used. So once again, if you put money into separate property money of 100,000 into an account that already had 50,000, and then over the years you spend 50,000 of that, it's going to be presumed what's left in that account is the 100,000, because they're going to presume that the community came out first. So in that method, you're going to have to trace and show each deposit, withdrawals, everything that came in and out, and the character of those deposits and withdrawals as they're done. So that's usually done by using a ledger, and then we'll just basically trace each deposit in and out of that account. So you can see how it would get pretty tedious over several years of in and out, in and out, in and outs in an account. So really the best way to do or to be able to trace is keep them separate. So if you get an inheritance, put it into a separate account, and then transfer interest every month over. Then we keep a nice clean account for that separate property money. The fifth method is a pro rata method, and that's used when both separate and community funds are held in an account and the party can prove the character of the account's original balance but not the character of the later transfers. And under that method, transactions are portioned, or they're prorated between separate and community estates based on the ratio of separate property and community property in the original balance. So this would be, you put your separate property inheritance into your community property bank account, and then you keep putting income and other community property in there. And if you put in 100,000 of separate property and 100,000 of community property funds, then they're going to look and say 50% of the balance on divorce is going to be separate and 50% is going to be community, if you opened up that account with those two different values. So the community and the separate property are used to open a bank account. So that's kind of the different methods that we use. Um, Tracing is very time consuming. So the cleaner that you can keep transactions during the marriage, the better. Um, so you just want to make sure that you always keep very good records. I know we never planned that divorce could happen, but you know, things happen. So it's always good to make sure that you protect yourself and that you keep those good, clean records if you ever want to prove that money is your separate property. This could also come in very, very handy to do this if it may not even be a divorce. Maybe one spouse needs to file bankruptcy for whatever reason. And then that way we can make sure that the separate property funds of the non-filing spouse for bankruptcy are protected from the creditors of the filing spouse. And so it's always good to make sure that you keep things very clean. Once again, you can do this by agreement. So if you and your spouse want to enter into a post-nuptial agreement after you're married, prenuptial before you're married, then you can make sure that those funds are kept very clean. I always suggest that you have some sort of marital agreement, either pre or post-nuptial, if you have a spouse that's got a business, that's their business. That way the non-business owning spouse is protected in case anything goes wrong with that business. Anyway, I hope everybody enjoys their weekend. Right now it's nice and beautiful outside here in Lake City, Texas. And I hear we're going to have storms move in and out. So everybody be safe and have a fun weekend. And we'll see you next week.